talk about algorithmic bias in credit scoring. And on the website of the Credit Research Center, you will find the talks from previous conferences. In the past conference in 2021, there were many papers on algorithmic bias, of fairness in credit scoring. This is really one of the hot topics. This is really one of the topics that the industry and academics are trying to resolve right now. And that's why credit scoring is one of the most frequently used examples when anyone talks about algorithmic bias in general. So in my today's talk, I would like, first of all, to explain why credit scoring and algorithmic bias go together, and then explain some principles of how it works in practice. I will have also to introduce the laws that govern credit scoring models, and in particular anti-discrimination laws. To put it simply, there are certain variables or certain characteristics that are not allowed to be used in credit scoring models. This follows a general legal position on equal treatment. However, what is happening right now, the public seems to be more concerned about with equal outcome, that the result of certain procedures should be fair or equal. And this is not really easy to achieve. And I will show an example based on the real data, the real life example, where I will try to explain how equal treatment and equal outcome work, or rather do not work together in practice. And I will finish with some conclusions and also outline some problems. This is really a very, very wide and substantial topic. I will try to be on time and leave some time for questions. So why credit scoring? Yeah, if you look online, you will find lots of information. So on algorithmic bias, and in almost every paper, people would mention financial services, discrimination of fairness, and credit scoring is one of the favorite examples. So I used Google Scholar and searched for the keyword algorithmic bias, and it returned approximately 17,200 papers. And then I changed my search to credit scoring and algorithmic bias, and the number of papers was 16,900. So almost every paper would at least mention credit scoring. So, and when people talk about algorithmic bias, they normally refer to General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, as the major piece of legislation that is relevant for algorithmic bias. However, GDPR only indirectly touches on equality and fairness. It introduced the right not to be subjected to the algorithmic decision making and the right to get the explanation behind the algorithmic decisions. But it did not really impose any specific restrictions in terms of fairness. Fairness really comes, or fairness regulations really come from different types of laws. But before moving to these laws, I would like to explain what is credit scoring. In the most general form, this is a decision support system used in lending to individuals and businesses, and its main aim to produce one number, which is the summary of credit worthiness or risk of a particular credit applicant. And this is normally estimated or measured by probability of default. Probability of default is estimated on historic data. So we need some historic sample where we have previous performance of previous borrowers and some characteristics that can be observed at the point of application. So before we observe the performance, we need to observe some other variables that can be connected to this performance. The most common one would be previous credit history, but also traditionally there's a lot of personal information which is used in credit scoring, although now personal information is less important compared to financial data that becomes available, for example, through open banking or internet, web browsing. Lots of other interesting sources are appearing right now. But in a very basic traditional form, people apply for credit, they fill in the application form, they may give some personal information like age and previously gender. Now gender is prohibited. And the lenders would try to link this information with their target variable, which is normally binary, good or bad customer, 0, 1. And in this sense, credit scoring models are just binary classifiers. They are not different from any other predictive models. And they are, and that is why any classifier, binary classifier, be it statistical or machine learning, can be used. Logistic regression is one of the most widely used because it is easily interpretable. However, in recent years, there have been experiments with lots of other machine learning, deep learning algorithms. What is important to remember or keep in mind is that credit scoring models are predictive. They are not explanatory or causal models. So in this sense, credit scoring is closer to computer science rather than finance or economics. So we are not trying to explain why people default. We're just taking what can be observed on the surface and using associations to predict into the future. So let me show very briefly an example. This is an old style credit scoring table that was used maybe at very early days when credit scoring appeared, and it was 40s, 50s of the previous century. Nowadays, of course, all this information is included into the computer program, but the principle is the same. You have some characteristics or variables, time at current address, residential status. Within each characteristic, you have some attributes or categories. Like, for example, for residential status, you have owner, tenant, living with parents, or unknown. And for each category, some points are assigned that reflect the risk of previous borrowers. So previously, the owners were the best. Here, the more points are given to good customers. So in a way, we are predicting probability of being good, but with binary definition, it doesn't really matter. And this is also the principle which is used by all lenders and credit bureaus. For example, if you get your credit score from a credit bureau, normally higher score corresponds to better credit status. So the application, the points can be assigned in different ways. The most usual way, if we are talking about logistic regression, these will be coefficients coming from logistic regressions, but transformed in some way or scaled in some way. So if we have two different applicants, we can assign points based on their observable characteristics and then add up, and here's our final measure of their creditworthiness. Obviously, this first applicant is better credit risk than this second applicant. However, it doesn't mean that the first will be accepted and the second will be rejected. It all depends on the risk appetite of a particular lender. So what we can do with this risk summary, we can rank order or risk order our customers from the very best to the very risky. And here I'm using just two characteristics, residential status and time at address, for illustration purposes. Normally you have between 10 to 15 characteristics in a commercial credit scoring model, and each characteristic may have up to 10 different categories. So it's really not feasible trying to map all different combinations of categories that you may have, but with one single number, rank ordering is really simple. And you, the bank, the lender, can then select where to draw the line, the cutoff, and this will determine the acceptance and rejection rates. People above the line will be accepted, people below this line will be rejected, and we can be more conservative, accept better risk, but by doing so we are accepting less people, or we can move in other direction. We can accept more people, but so all these people above, say 15, will be accepted. But then the level of risk in our accepted population will be higher. It's really the trade-off that each individual bank decides based on their objectives and also based on the strategy and the variables that go into credit scoring also are dependent or vary between different lenders. There isn't really the credit scoring model. It can contain all different combination of variables, and the weights will be also different. However, there are common rules that govern what can be used and what cannot be used. And this goes back to 70s of the last century, when the first anti-discrimination law was adopted, and that was in the United States, and that was Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So it explicitly prohibited the use of race, color, national origin, gender, marital status, religion, receipt of public assistance, exercise of consumer protection rights. These variables cannot be included into credit scoring models. Age has a special status. It can be used, but with some conditions or constraints. In EU, there are several legislation documents that govern what can be used and what cannot be used, articles in the treaty, and also specific gender directive, which prohibits the use of gender in decision making. And also there is a proposal for religion, disability, age, sexual orientation. And this list of variables is more or less the same for all countries. There are, of course, international differences, but this is the list that the lenders would not use or include into credit scoring models. And what is more important, once they stopped using these variables, many banks stopped collecting this information. If gender was collected previously, now it is not collected. Marital status is not collected. Although some information may be still obtained, say, from marketing, because for marketing, they need to know certain personal information. But irrespective of all these minor differences that may exist in different countries, the general approach or legal position is the same. The main distinction is between direct and indirect discrimination, and direct discrimination concerns principle of equal treatment. This is really fundamental principle in equality law, and it means that people should be treated equally, and it translates that certain information cannot be used in algorithms. It is also known as procedural fairness. However, the public is more concerned with other type of fairness, which is outcome fairness or equal outcome. Because when you look at any media publications about discrimination or algorithmic bias, the evidence of algorithmic bias is always based on the outcome. Ethnic minorities are being rejected more for credit compared to white majority, or they are paying higher interest rates. So the society and media really concentrates on outcomes, and they don't really care how these outcomes arise, whether it's through equal treatment or unequal treatment. And in many cases, it is just assumed that if you have unequal outcome, this is because unequal treatment. Well, this is really the sign of discrimination. However, this is not as simple as this. The relationship between equal treatment and equal outcome is much more complicated. And I'm going to show this by using my empirical example later on. Just here I would like to emphasize once again, direct discrimination is 100% unlawful with indirect discrimination, which may be connected to unequal outcomes. There are certain conditions when it can be justified. Although the law says it would be ideal if there's no discrimination, either direct or indirect, but again, in practice, it's not really possible to achieve. So now let's move to my illustration, which comes from the paper. I've included the reference at the end. So we analyzed portfolio of car loans from a major bank, and it was some time ago when gender was already prohibited, but marital status was still allowed to use. And we were really lucky to get this data set where we got gender, because as I said before, now one of the difficulties of conducting research on discrimination, you simply do not have the data. It's not being collected. The majority of published papers come from the US, where there is the regulatory requirement to report lending rates based on race and gender and other protected characteristics. But this is not the case in Europe. Anyway, we are very grateful to this bank that provided the data for our research. The bank chose to remain anonymous, which is a standard position of data providers in our field. So quite substantial data set, around 80,000 of customers. What is important here that women constitute just a little bit more than a quarter of the sample. And again, talking about algorithmic bias, this data would be labeled as biased data. However, one of the difficulties of conducting research in the area of algorithmic bias is multiplicity of different terms. Different people or the same term may be interpreted by different people in different ways. So this particular sample is representative of the customer base of this bank. So from statistical point of view, it is not a biased sample, although, yeah, we may also argue that there are maybe some flaws in marketing campaign, but there are also general societal problems or just traditions. It's just traditionally that men apply more for car loans than women. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that we have the sample where male subpopulation dominates female population. But also their default rates are different. So the general default rate is 1.68%, which is very low. But with car loans, we're dealing with secured credit, so it's not surprising. For credit cards, it will be higher. But female applicants or customers have slightly lower default rate, 1.3, as compared to male customers, 1.8. So they are better credit risks compared to men. I would like to make a disclaimer that I'm not trying to say that women are always better credit risk. This is really dependent on many other factors: the country, the type of credit products. And if you look at different papers, some papers find that men are better, others papers find the opposite. However, I'm not really concerned about who is better, who is not. What I'm trying to show here is we have protected group which is in minority and which is actually better credit risk. And what happens to this group? It can be women, it can be some other group. So what we did, we followed the general or the standard steps in develop credit scoring models. We really tried to simulate what would happen with this sample if we build the legal model without gender and then add gender and see what happens, or another way around. Start with illegal model, drop gender. We also developed two separate models just for men and women, but for the sake of time and simplicity, I do not report these results. But I would like to emphasize that only model without gender is the legal one. Model 1 is illegal, and segmented models for men and women are also illegal because that's the violation of the principle of equal treatment. By building separate models, we're treating men and women differently. So, and this is illegal. This is direct discrimination. Then we compared these models from 2 points of view. Predictive accuracy, because that's what the lenders are interested in. They want the most predictive and powerful models. But also we looked at what happens in terms of acceptance, rejection for men and women. So looking at the consequences from consumer point of view. In our final model, we had 11 significant variables. Marital status, number of kids or dependents, income, time in employment, professional, loan duration, down payment, car price, car age, phone given and gender. So all these variables were statistically significant, and gender was statistically significant too. So there is association with credit performance. So predictive accuracy we measured with area under the ROC curve, which is a standard measure in predictive modeling. I will not go into details, but higher values correspond to better prediction. The closer you are to 1, the better. So for the total sample, so we followed the standard approach of training the model on a separate sample and then testing it on the independent sample. So as you see, predictive accuracy is higher for train as compared for the test, but this is to be accepted. The difference is not large. That means we don't really have overfitting. And the numbers are pretty good. AUC of close to 0.9 is a very good result. However, there isn't really any difference in terms of whether we use gender or we do not use gender. So there are some kind of minor variation, but this is really just random variation. We did not even do any statistical tests because we were pretty sure that they will be statistically insignificant. What is important, though, is that for men, the predictive accuracy is higher than for women. And again, we can take it, if we are concerned with outcome, we can take it as one sign of discrimination. Because if women are in minority, the model will be just dominated. Due to statistical rules, it will be dominated by the majority of subsample, which is male. And that, again, is not surprising that predictive accuracy is higher when we test it only on subsample of men as compared to women. But the most, again, the difference if we use or do not use gender is really negligible, which means that for lenders it does not really matter. They can go with the legal approach and achieve the same level of predictive accuracy and do not incur increased bad debt.
Can I ask a question about this? It's important to understand here now whether you are looking at the same model trained on all data, and then the two right-hand columns look at the performance of the model for men only, women only, or whether these two right-hand columns look at models trained exclusively on men.
No, here I present just the results for the model trained on the total sample.
Okay.
So in the paper we also have results for these segmented models, but I'm not including this here. Men only refers to sort of looking at test sample where we keep only men, but the model applied was trained on the total sample.
Yes. Clearly the men are dominating the model by their shares.
But it's interesting that when, irrespective of this, women are getting better acceptance rates. So let me talk about this graph. It's sort of quite, it's quite packed. So what we did, we again looked at the test sample, and here we also removed the married applicants, because the referees quite rightly said that if we have a married couple, it's normally the husband who applies for the car loan or buys the car. And so this graph is based only on single men and single women. And what we see here is different levels of rejection rates. So the percentage of rejected applicants, so cutoff levels, is this cutoff that I've shown earlier. And so we just looked at 10 different versions. Here we report, say, if we reject from 20% of the highest risk up to 90% rejection, which is not realistic. So probably we can concentrate just on the lower or left-hand side of the graph as more realistic scenarios. These values refer to the total rejection rate, but then we also looked from the total rejected sample, what percentage of men is rejected and what percentage of women is rejected. So if we have equal outcomes, then we wouldn't really have these 4 lines. We will have just one line. All these 4 lines will be overlapping because if we accept, say, 50%, reject 50% of all applicants in our sample, in the equal world, we should be rejecting 50% of men, 50% of women. And if we change our cutoff scores, this should not change. But in reality, what we have, so the blue lines correspond to rejected males, and red lines correspond to rejected females. The solid lines are for models that include gender, and the dashed lines without gender, or the legal ones. So the legal models are closer to sort of equality point, but not quite. And obviously women benefit or would benefit from gender being included, because with gender models they are rejected less. Men obviously benefit from the opposite situation. So what happens here was, first of all, we removed gender, but disparity remains. So irrespective of which model we use, women are getting better deals. They're still rejected less, which is good news. But and this happens because gender is correlated with many characteristics that are included in the model, which I'm going to show next. But what is important is that women are subsidizing men, because in a way, because if gender is not included, they are losing these kind of additional places that they could get, and these places are replaced by men. So men getting more credit and replacing women that could have got this credit if gender was included. So I don't really think that this is intended outcome or situation that the society is trying to achieve. But unfortunately, this is what happens when we follow the principle of equal treatment. If, for example, the objective would be to achieve equal outcome, this is actually very easy to achieve technically. You just set 2 different cutoffs for men and women separately and accept 50% of all male applicants, 50% of all female applicants. Completely equality, yes.
But this then is in contrary, because you would need to collect the gender of the person.
Exactly. So it contradicts the principle of equal treatment. Yeah. So, and that's why it's not possible to do this. So it would not be legal to do this. However, sort of this is one problem, and another really important and difficult problem is what to do with correlations between different predictors. So here's the Markov blanket, which shows direct and indirect connections of gender with other predictors, and so flag is our good-bad status, our target variable. So gender is directly connected with occupation, so this is conditional independence, and marital status and net income, and also indirectly connected to all other characteristics in the model. And the law is really not clear in terms of what to do with these correlations. Are they legal? Well, if we follow the legal principle, they are legal. But from the point of view of just common sense, possibly it's not quite fair to include characteristics that are highly correlated with protected ones. But then another question is, what would be the benchmark? Where do you stop? What level of correlations would be permissible and what level of correlations would be impermissible? So it's really a very gray and unresolved area in terms of how to deal with these correlations. So this really brings me to almost to the end of my presentation. So what I really wanted to show is equal treatment does not translate into equal outcomes. And if we want to achieve sort of equal outcomes, we should allow the use of all relevant information in decision making. I've only used logistic regression in this example. And when we started this project, we planned to use machine learning algorithms for comparison, but other people were faster than us. They published already the work, which I also included in references. And also, there wasn't really much point in doing this because one could easily anticipate that machine learning will utilize these correlations between different predictors in a much more efficient way. And so the disparity between the groups will be higher. And that's what all this paper by Fuster et al. Showed empirically. I think another important lesson or point that we can take from credit scoring is that better customers will subsidize poor risks. And this is something not quite discussed in algorithmic bias literature, because normally there is an assumption, okay, just lenders will pay. They have the money, they will pay for any loss in predictive accuracy. What people do not realize is everyone has to pay. If we want the ethnic minorities to get more access to credit, it means that white majority has to make sacrifices. It's not just lenders. The consumers have to make these sacrifices too. And I don't think this is actually discussed at all. I'm pretty sure that the society on the whole will be fine, but I think this needs to be shown and needs to be communicated. And also it may actually change the current policy, this equal treatment, equal outcome that we have right now. Yeah, so when we build statistical machine learning models, we really need to think about who is minority, who is majority, and how to deal with this. Correlations, really difficult problem to tackle. Another important lessons lesson coming from credit scoring. And it would be nice to have separate law for algorithmic decision making rather than standard anti-discrimination legislation that covers all sorts of situations, including human judgment and also algorithmic decisions. So what is happening right now? Yeah, there is a lot of discussion in terms of what the next step or the next regulations could look like, but I don't think there's a lot of progress. I haven't seen any sensible or realistic proposals. The difficulty is that it's not easy to formulate or to define what constitutes equal outcome. The advantage of the existing regulation is that it is more or less unambiguous and it is easy to implement. You have the list of characteristics, you just don't use them, don't even collect them, and you are fine. You are not violating the law. When it comes to equal outcome, then there are lots of questions. For example, which metric to use? There are 26, my PhD student who works on this topic, she calculated at least 26 different definitions of fairness. And I think at least 15 of them are based on different measures of equal outcome. And no one really knows which measure is better and which should be used. And shall we try to achieve like 100% parity? At the moment, everyone is talking about 80% as being the minimum that should be targeted. But why 80% and not 70, not 90? This is not clear. But another important problem that in absence of the data, the sensitive variables, for example, gender or race, it is really difficult to, we can plan or experiment different interventions. It is very difficult to assess how effective they are if we don't have the data. The industry actually gets around it by looking at publicly available data, for example, census, and trying to construct proxies that they can use for monitoring reasons. And what I don't really understand why make things so complicated. If, for example, in employment area, we all fill the questionnaires at the end of job applications, where we have to state our gender, race, and other sensitive characteristics for monitoring reasons. And the majority of us are absolutely fine with this. Why can't we do this in other areas for monitoring reasons only? So I think that would be a really good step forward towards fairer society if we allow at least this. So I think here are some references to related literature, and that's it. Yeah, I think I ran over slightly, but there's still some time for questions.
Yes.